All right, boys and girls, nobody's done this yet, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to solder a OSE 8 8mm connector onto some 6-gauge wire. This is really not terribly complicated. It just requires the use of high power electronics and a will, determination to get it done right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to knock off some of this sleeving from the wire itself. It's not much. I'm going to overdo it by a little bit so that it will give me some extra space on the actual wire itself, because if you do it too tight, you can possibly leave out some wire strands from the actual connector itself, and doing that is not a terribly great idea. Okay, when you peel back the wire, you're going to see, and hopefully you can see the camera, you're going to get all this beautiful wire to come out. I know it's super fuzzy. Twist it a little bit as you go. That'll keep all the strands nice and tight, and then they will eventually just go pop and kind of furl out a little bit. So now you're in the starting position. This is your wire. Cool. Now we need to make sure that we've got our connector lined up and ready to go. We're going to use some flux. And this is just going to be to basically prime the area so to receive as much solder as possible so it doesn't fall or doesn't not stick, because usually you have to get both ends, the connector and the wire, super hot and ready to go. One thing I don't do is I don't want to pre-solder this connector at all, because it is very slender. It's very tight for the wire to get in there, so you're not going to have a lot of extra space to put in anything else. And if you pre-solder the wire, it kind of makes it plump, little mushroom, and that is not what you want to do. That's kind of the opposite of the point. So what we're going to do here is do our best not to make this whole contraption go out of stage for me. And really all these helping hands are going to do is just kind of keep things lined up. I'm not expecting the world, but when I put this in here, it fits just nicely. And if you're looking at it on the detail in the camera, you'll be able to see it kind of fits in there nice. If I did have solder on there, it would have been a little bit bigger, and it might have been just big enough that it wouldn't have fit. So that's why I've gone ahead and gone not pre-soldered. Unfortunately, I grabbed it at a bad spot, so it's pulling it out. Okay, now we're pushing it in, and that's good. One thing I'm going to use here that is not common is a Radio Shack 230 watt or 150 watt soldering iron. And all that really means is generally soldering irons are in the realm of about 60 watts. This is a lot beefier. Some people use torches to do something like this. It is very easy to overburn something like this. Clearly the connector is made of nylon. So the sleeve is made out of silicone, so that can take up to 200 C. The connector is made of nylon, and that's really awesome because it can take high heat, and it's big and bulky, and the actual connector itself is nice and how to say it, it can absorb a lot of heat and disperse it, which is kind of the point of what you want for a lot of big beefy connectors, but you also want surface area and you want contact. So what's going to make a big deal out of this is you can kind of see the soldering iron is getting red hot, which is really, really good. That means that the copper on it is almost to its melting point. Not necessarily awesome, but it's super, super hot. And what we want to do, and you can kind of see that I've got the wire plugged in actually to another back end and some more wire actually into a battery as well. Not actually a big deal, everything's all disconnected. But the major factor here is that the connector itself, if you heat this part up right here too much, you're actually going to melt the connector. And if you melt the connector, it's going to come out of its housing and it's going to de-align with what you need, and that's a problem. So effectively what we want to do is we just want to heat up the wire itself right here, and we want to heat up the housing just enough so that it accepts the solder and everything without going nuts. So hopefully, and I'm no video magician, but hopefully you can see everything that's going on here. So the heating element, pushing it down on the wire, it's melting into the wire itself very fast, but it's not melting it's not getting into the housing just yet. So what we want to do is pool up enough solder in here that it starts touching the actual housing of the connector, and it will start to pool. And the whole issue with this matter is I don't want to get anything too hot and have it all melt. I just want the solder to melt into the wire. Super tricky to do that, and the reason why we use such a high heat gun is so that we have the ability to melt the solder. Because if you take a little heat gun and do a similar thing, it'll actually wimp out. It will lose the heat that it's doing because it's actually dissipating heat so much into the copper that it can't keep up. It's literally struggling to keep up. Now I got a lot of solder on here. It's actually feeling a little difficult in the gun, and it's feeling like it's getting connected to the connector itself, which is good. Now what I'm doing is I'm trying to distribute it because the connector is getting lower. I imagine this is out of shot already. So I'm gonna take a moment, let that chill. Try and line up our shot one more time. See if we can get this in a spot where everybody can see, all the children can see what's going on in the classroom. Try and line that up one more time. Oh, you didn't fall out of shot too much. That's good. Let's see if I press you down a little bit. That'll work. Nice and close. There we go. All right. So things are looking good. Things are looking pretty tight so far. I'm looking around the connector. I don't know if you can see this, but underneath there's actually a gap. There's good solder connection on top and probably into the back of the connector because that's where all the flux was. But the problem with that is that it's not fully seated in. It's maybe halfway there. So you actually have to heat it up enough so that the bottom gets hot and accepts the solder down at the bottom area. What I'm doing is I'm cleaning off the tip here, and then we'll eventually get it all in the way. Let it heat up for a second. All right, so now that we've got the top done, super important that, and you can kind of see it here, you don't want it to spill over the edge. There's a small little gap on the outside. It's maybe 1.5 millimeters wide. We have a connector, or we have a cover here that will keep everything from touching, kind of like heat shrink, except this is specifically matched for this unit. Now what I'm doing here is something called a reheat. I've already done the soldering. I've got solder in there, but the problem is that I need to readjust things, and I don't want anything to pop out, but I also want to utilize the solder that I've got in there. So I've got to make good contact with the solder gun, with everything in there. I'm actually heating up the wire. I'm heating up the connector, and you can actually see if we get it just right, it's going to suck. I'm going to make a little bubble right next to the connector, and it's going to suck the solder into it because there's just enough space. It's a wicking effect. It's kind of like if you put a sheet of plastic on a cable or something like that, and put a little droplet of water next to the edge, it will actually suck the water underneath the table. All right, so what I'm doing is I'm giving a little pressure, make it sit down in that connector a little bit. Now, one of the things you see coming up off the top is rosin. It is effectively the thing that makes solder flow around. It is the happy juice for all soldering things. I think we're good there. So it ensures that the solder itself can flow. Otherwise, you have to heat up the metals to really, really high temperatures, and that can be an absolute problem. But in this case, you can kind of see it here. Now you can see the wires themselves. They're coated in solder. There is no visible gap around at least the top of the wire. The space around the connector itself is clear. We haven't dropped any solder into anything outside of the housing, which is excellent. So that means that our connector is going to be good to go to push it in when we come to that point. And it also looks like nothing on the inside of the connector has melted, which extra bonus points. Okay, so we just soldered the negative side of the terminal, and now we're going to join everything up. I'm going to get everything kind of delatched or deharnessed from the battery connector here. Hopefully everything shows in the camera view. But you can kind of see that there is hopefully open solder there. And we've got this cover that's going to go over the top. Now, it is a little tricky to put together sometimes, and sometimes it requires a lot of force. And I don't know if you can kind of see that there, but there's a couple open holes at the top and on the bottom. And if we did all of this right, yeah, we did negative, negative, positive, positive. Now we just kind of effortlessly shove these together. And after enough time, sometimes you have to lean on them, sometimes you have to get a little screwdriver involved, but really, this is just a matter of time before it all comes together, especially if you've left it out of the harm's way of filling in those areas around the connector. So hopefully this was informative. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks so much. All right, here's what it looks like all seated together. You can kind of see that the connector is in nice and tight. In fact, if we look even closer, maybe the light can show it. There's some pins in these holes, and it's ready to go. So, good luck.